Years after the mission that took more from him than any report could explain, former Navy SEAL Nathan Cole lived quietly near the Coronado Harbor with a K9 named Atlas and a silence no one knew how to enter. Then one rainy afternoon, he saw an elderly woman standing beside a bus station with an old working dog pressed against her leg. At her feet lay a cardboard sign, "Free K9, can't keep him safe." The dog did not beg, he did not bark. He only lifted his tired head and watched the parking lot like he already knew danger was coming. Two men stepped out of a dark pickup and walked straight toward the old woman. One of them smiled and reached for the dog's collar. Nathan set his grocery bag down. Atlas moved beside him, silent and ready. "That's close enough," Nathan said. He thought he was only stopping two strangers from bullying an old woman. He was wrong. Before the rain stopped, Nathan would learn that the dog was not being given away because he was unwanted. He was being hunted, and the secret hidden on his collar could expose the truth about a dead soldier, a stolen house, and a company that had already decided one grieving mother should disappear quietly. Years after the mission that taught him silence could follow a man home, Nathan Cole lived near the Coronado Harbor, with a room too small for memories and a dog too loyal to let him disappear completely. Nathan was a male former U.S. Navy SEAL in his early 30s with an angular, rugged face, a sharp jawline, clean-shaven cheeks, cold blue-gray eyes, and a modern short undercut haircut with tight faded sides and a textured top. His disciplined, athletic build still carried the shape of military life, even when his days had been reduced to maintenance calls, cheap groceries, and nights spent listening to ships move in the dark. He wore a complete green digital camouflage uniform, properly fitted and buttoned, with a plain black belt and black combat boots. No vest, no weapon, no helmet, no extra gear. Just a man who looked like order had been built into him so tightly that grief had nowhere to spill. Beside him walked Atlas, a full-grown male Belgian Malinois K9, 4 to 5 years old, lean and muscular, with a deep Fonda mahogany coat, a distinct black facial mask, upright ears, and intense dark amber eyes. Atlas wore a tan tactical K9 vest and a simple working dog collar. He moved with focused obedience, always half a step behind Nathan's left side, always facing the same direction, always reading the world before Nathan had to. To other people, Atlas looked mission-ready. To Nathan, Atlas was the last living rhythm that kept his own mind from drifting too far into the past. That afternoon, rain had turned the streets near the harbor dark and reflective. The air smelled of diesel, wet rope, salt water, and old wood from the docks. Nathan had just left a small discount market with one paper bag in his hand, bread, canned soup, instant coffee, aspirin, and dog food bought, with the careful math of a man who never let himself pretend money was more forgiving than it was. He was halfway past the bus station when Atlas slowed. Nathan stopped immediately. Atlas did not pull. He never needed to. His ears lifted, his head turned toward the covered bench near the curb, and his body settled into a stillness Nathan knew better than speech. Under the bus shelter stood an elderly woman, maybe 74, small and frail with a slightly stooped posture. Her deeply lined face had the tired softness of someone who had spent a lifetime being polite to hardship. Pale blue eyes looked out from beneath white-gray hair tied in a low bun. She wore an old navy blue knitted cardigan over an ivory blouse, a charcoal gray skirt, cream wool socks, worn black slip-on shoes, and a faded silver wedding ring on her left hand. One thin, veined hand held a leash. The other rested against the back of a second dog. The dog beside her was an older male Belgian Malinois named Ranger, about 7 years old, thinner than Atlas, with a weathered fawn coat, a black mask faded slightly by age, and watchful amber eyes. He had the posture of a dog who had known commands, danger, and the difference between noise and threat. His ribs did not show, but he had lost the fullness of a younger working dog. Rain darkened his shoulders. He stood close to the old woman's leg, not begging for attention, not seeking shelter for himself, but placing his body where danger would have to pass him first. At their feet sat a damp cardboard sign held down by a small stone. "Free K9, can't keep him safe." Nathan read the words once, then again. Something tightened behind his ribs. He had seen men give up equipment, homes, medals, even names. But a dog was different. A dog like that was never just property. He glanced at the old woman's hand on Ranger's leash. She was not holding it like someone trying to get rid of a burden. She was holding it like someone trying not to lose the last thing that still answered when she called. Atlas gave a low sound in his throat. Not a bark, not a growl meant to frighten. A warning. At the same moment, Ranger turned his head toward the parking lot before any human looked that way. The two dogs, strangers until that second, were staring at the same dark pickup rolling slowly along the curb. Nathan felt the old coldness settle into him, the kind that did not belong to fear but to recognition. Dogs did not react like that to rain engines or ordinary men. They reacted like that when trouble had a scent. The pickup stopped. Two men stepped out. The first, Vince Mercer, was tall and narrow-faced, 38, with slick-back black hair, sharp cheekbones, and a smile that looked practiced in mirrors and sharpened on weaker people. He wore a black waterproof jacket over a dark gray Henley, black jeans, and black boots. His eyes moved over the old woman, the sign, Ranger's collar, then Nathan's uniform. He smiled anyway. The second man, Arlo Pike, 34, was shorter but thick through the shoulders, with a red face, a heavy neck, a very short buzz cut, and the restless impatience of a man who preferred pushing before thinking. His dark brown work jacket hung open over a black t-shirt, and his heavy boots hit the wet pavement too hard. "Well, look at that," Vince said, stopping too close to the sign. "Free K9. That mean he's broken, or you just got tired of feeding him." The old woman pulled Ranger's leash closer. Her voice was soft, but not empty. "He's not for you." Arlo laughed and leaned toward the dog. "Lady, the sign says free. Maybe we're doing you a favor." Ranger's shoulders rose by a fraction. Atlas stepped forward beside Nathan, his focus narrowing. Nathan set his grocery bag down on the wet concrete. The bread inside bent under the weight of the cans, but he did not look at it. "That's close enough," Nathan said. Both men turned. Vince's eyes traveled over Nathan's face, his uniform, his boots, the calm authority in his posture. "This your business?" Nathan did not raise his voice. "It is now." Arlo's hand drifted toward Ranger's collar. Ranger gave one controlled growl, deep enough to change the air under the shelter. The old woman's fingers trembled, but she did not let go. Nathan noticed that. Courage did not always stand tall. Sometimes it was a shaking hand that still refused to open. "There's a camera over the bus stop," Nathan said. "Another on the harbor office across the street. You keep crowding an elderly woman after she asked you to step back. This becomes harassment before the next bus arrives." Vince's smile thinned. "You a cop?" "No." "Then maybe keep walking." Nathan looked at him long enough for the rain to fill the silence. "You first." For a moment, no one moved. A gull cried over the harbor. Tires hissed on wet asphalt. Atlas and Ranger stood in separate lines of loyalty, both facing the same threat. Vince understood before Arlo did. Men like Vince survived by recognizing when a scene had stopped belonging to them. He stepped back, but his eyes remained on Ranger. "You don't know what that dog is carrying." Nathan's expression did not change. "Then explain it to someone who wants to hear you talk." Arlo muttered something under his breath, but Vince grabbed his sleeve and pulled him toward the pickup. They drove off slowly, the red brake lights bleeding through the rain. Nathan picked up the cardboard sign. The ink had begun to smear at the edges. The old woman looked ashamed before she looked afraid. "I wasn't trying to throw him away," she whispered. Nathan lowered his eyes to Ranger, then back to her. "What's your name, Mom?" "Margaret Hart." "And his?" Ranger. Her voice caught on the name. "He belonged to my son." Nathan waited. Margaret looked toward the harbor, where the cranes stood like black bones against the gray sky. "My son died trying to keep something from Harborline. Ranger was the only one who came home." Atlas stared at Ranger's collar. Ranger stared at Nathan as if deciding whether this man was finally the answer to a prayer no one had dared say aloud. Nathan thought he had stopped two men from harassing an old woman. He was wrong. The dog was not being given away because he was unwanted. He was being hunted because he had brought the truth home. Margaret Hart did not move right away after the pickup disappeared. She stood under the bus shelter with one hand around Ranger's leash and the other pressed against the damp sleeve of her navy cardigan, as if she were holding herself together by habit alone. Nathan Cole watched the street until the dark pickup turned out of sight, but Atlas kept staring after it longer than necessary. Ranger did the same. The two Belgian Malinois dogs had never met before that afternoon, yet both seemed to understand something the humans had only begun to name. "Mom," Nathan said carefully, "you shouldn't stay here." Margaret looked down at the cardboard sign in his hand. Rain had softened the edges until the words looked bruised. "I didn't know what else to do," she said. Her voice carried dignity, but the kind that had been worn thin by too many official letters and too many nights listening for a car outside. "Ranger was my son's dog. Daniel brought him home after the company said he was too difficult to place. But Daniel said a dog that doesn't trust quickly usually has a reason. She touched Ranger's head, and the old K9 leaned into her palm for half a second before resuming his watch. Nathan understood that kind of dog. He understood that kind of man, too. Margaret explained only in pieces as rain ticked against the shelter roof. Daniel Hart had been 42, a former Army sergeant with a square, kind face, short brown hair, warm brown eyes, and the careful hands of a man who could calm an animal without forcing obedience. After leaving service, he worked night security for Harbor Line Security Group at a restricted cargo section near Harbor Gate 12. He had lived with Margaret in the small house his father once repaired board by board, and Ranger had slept on the porch beneath Daniel's window. Then, 3 months earlier, Daniel had died during a night shift. The report called it a fall. Margaret's mouth tightened when she said that. My son walked rooftops in storms and came home from places I was never allowed to ask about. He did not simply fall because a floor was wet. Nathan did not answer with comfort. He knew bad reports could sound clean when someone powerful needed them clean. After the funeral, Margaret continued, men came asking about Ranger. Then came letters about the house. Repairs, code issues, unpaid fees I had never heard of. A woman from Harbor Line told me signing would make things easier. She looked at Nathan then, ashamed. Easier for whom, I suppose I should have asked. Nathan saw the tremor in her fingers and the stiff way Ranger shifted his weight. The old dog's joints hurt. Nathan could tell by the careful placement of his back legs. Have you eaten today? He asked. Margaret straightened, offended by the kindness more than the question. I'm fine. Nathan's eyes moved to her pale face, then to the small cloth purse tucked under her arm. That wasn't the question. For a moment she looked almost like a child caught hiding pain from a parent. Toast this morning, she admitted. Ranger ate more than I did. Nathan nodded once, not making her pay for the truth with pity. My room has a lock. You keep the key. Ranger stays with you. If you want to leave, you leave. Margaret's eyes narrowed. She had survived long enough to distrust easy rescue. Why would you do that? Nathan looked at Ranger, then at Atlas. Because both dogs knew those men before I did. At that exact moment, Ranger stepped toward Nathan, slow and deliberate, and pressed his nose against the lower pocket of Nathan's uniform blouse. Nathan went still. Atlas did not correct him. Ranger sniffed once, then lifted his eyes to Nathan's face with an expression so focused it almost felt human. Nathan reached into the pocket and pulled out a small, worn K9 challenge coin he had carried for years, its edges dulled by grief and habit. Ranger's ears softened. Margaret covered her mouth. Daniel had one like that, she whispered. He said men who carried those didn't always talk about what they lost. Nathan closed his fingers around the coin. He had not shown it to anyone in years. Somehow, in the middle of rain and fear, an old dog had found the part of him he kept hidden closest to his chest. Nathan's rented room sat above a closed bait shop 2 blocks from the harbor, reached by a narrow outdoor staircase that smelled of wet metal and salt. Inside, the room was small but orderly. One bed pushed against the wall, a folded sleeping mat near the door, a dented table, a 2-burner stove, a stack of maintenance manuals, and a locked green military storage box beneath the window. It was not a home arranged for welcome. It was a place designed for surviving another day. Margaret noticed but said nothing. Ranger entered first, checked the corners, then took position between Margaret and the door. Atlas moved beside Nathan and watched Ranger with alert respect, not challenge. Nathan set a spare key on the table. That's yours while you're here. Bathroom is through there. Back stairs are outside the kitchen door. Window opens, but it sticks. Margaret stared at the key as if it weighed more than metal. You give keys to strangers? No, Mom, Nathan said. Only to people who need to know they're not trapped. Dinner was simple. Canned soup stretched with rice, bread warmed on the burner, and the last piece of chicken from Nathan's refrigerator shredded into warm water for the dogs. Margaret noticed him divide the chicken evenly between Atlas and Ranger, then take none for himself. She also noticed the notebook beside his elbow, full of tight handwriting. Rent, fuel, groceries, dog food, medication. Kindness, she realized, was not always soft. Sometimes it looked like a man giving away the part he had already planned to need. They ate quietly. Ranger lowered himself near Margaret's feet with a restrained sigh. Atlas lay near the door, eyes half open. Margaret told Nathan that Daniel's last words to her had been plain and frightening. Mom, if anything happens to me, don't let Harbor Line take Ranger. She had thought grief made every sentence sound like a warning. Now she was no longer sure. Near midnight, Nathan slept on the mat by the door, boots within reach. Margaret rested on the bed fully clothed, one hand hanging down toward Ranger. The room had almost settled when Nathan's breathing changed. His hand clenched around the blanket, his shoulders locked, his eyes opened, but not to the room. Atlas rose immediately and came close without touching. Then Ranger stood, joints stiff, and crossed the floor. He sat a few feet from Nathan and began to breathe slowly, deeply, steadily, in and out. Atlas matched the rhythm. Nathan's eyes found the two dogs through the dark. The harbor room returned piece by piece, rain, table, window, Margaret, Ranger, Atlas. Margaret watched silently, tears standing in her pale eyes, not from fear but recognition. Daniel said Ranger always knew when someone was trying not to fall apart, she whispered. Nathan swallowed hard and looked at the old dog. By morning, when Atlas began sniffing insistently at Ranger's scratched metal name tag, Nathan already knew the night had changed something. Ranger was not a burden Margaret was trying to give away. He was a witness Daniel had trusted to come home. By morning, the rain had thinned into a gray mist that clung to the harbor windows and turned the room quiet in a way that made every small sound matter. Nathan Cole was already awake, sitting at the dented table with yesterday's coffee untouched beside his hand. Margaret Hart sat on the edge of the bed, her navy cardigan wrapped tight around her small shoulders, watching Ranger with the anxious patience of a mother waiting outside a hospital room. Atlas stood near the old K9, ears forward, nose fixed on the scratched metal name tag hanging from Ranger's collar. Ranger did not pull away. He only looked at Nathan with those tired amber eyes as if the decision had already been made somewhere beyond words. He never let strangers touch that tag, Margaret said softly. Daniel put it on him himself. Nathan reached for his small maintenance kit, the same kit he used to fix loose hinges and broken dock lights. His movements were slow, careful, respectful. Then you should be the one to tell him it's all right. Margaret swallowed, lowered herself beside Ranger, and placed one thin, veined hand against his neck. Easy, boy, she whispered, using a voice that seemed to belong to another kitchen, another morning, another life. Hold steady. Ranger's ears softened. He stood still. Nathan used a narrow tool to examine the tag. It looked ordinary at first. Dull metal, the name Ranger nearly worn smooth, a few scratches near the bottom edge. But Atlas had been right. There was a seam so fine most people would have missed it, a hairline split beneath the lower rim. Nathan worked the tool into the edge and gently twisted. The tag clicked. Margaret flinched, as if the sound had come from inside her own chest. A paper-thin compartment opened, and inside, sealed in clear waterproof film, was a tiny black storage chip no larger than a fingernail. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Even the dog seemed to understand the room had changed. Nathan lifted the chip with tweezers and set it on a folded napkin. Margaret stared at it until her eyes filled. Daniel did come home, she whispered. Nathan looked at her. She touched Ranger's head. Not all of him, but enough to keep trying. Nathan did not try to read the chip on his own laptop. He owned an old machine with a cracked corner and a battery that died if the charger moved wrong. More importantly, he knew that evidence was only useful if handled carefully. He placed the chip in a small plastic evidence sleeve from his military storage box, then labeled it with the date, time, and where it had been found. Margaret watched him write. You've done this before. Nathan capped the pen. Not like this. He meant it. A battlefield had rules, even when the world pretended it did not. This was different. This was an old woman, a dead son, a loyal dog, and a company that might have hidden behind paperwork, because paperwork did not look like violence until it had already taken everything. Before Nathan could close the storage box, Ranger rose and limped toward it. He lowered his nose into the open lid and nudged aside a faded leash, a rolled patch, and a stack of old photographs bound with a rubber band. One photo slid loose onto the floor. Nathan reached for it, then stopped. In the picture, a younger Nathan stood in a hot training yard beside several handlers and dogs. In the back row, half shadowed by sun glare, was Daniel Hart. He looked younger, leaner, with the same square-kind face Margaret had described, one hand held low near a nervous dog's collar. Margaret covered her mouth. That's my boy. Nathan stared at the image, and the memory came back not as a story but as a feeling. Heat, dust, helicopter noise, and a quiet soldier who had waited longer than anyone else because a frightened dog needed one more minute. Nathan had not known Daniel well, but he remembered the patience. And suddenly this was no longer just a stranger's case. It was a thread from his own past, pulled tight across the years. Nathan called Ron Maddox just after 8. Ron was 61, a broad-shouldered older veteran with short gray hair, a weathered face, calm brown eyes, and the slow voice of a man who had spent years helping frightened people survive official forms. He worked out of a cramped Veterans Assistance office behind a community center, where the walls were covered with service photos, old unit coins, and notices about housing support. Ron trusted evidence more than speeches and silence more than panic. When Nathan explained only the essentials, Ron did not waste time with surprise. "Bring the papers," he said. "Bring the chip. Bring the dog if the dog is part of the chain." Then, after a pause, he added, "And Nathan, don't let anyone from Harborline know you're coming." Margaret gathered what she had from her cloth purse and a folded envelope she kept under her blouse. Daniel's death notice, 2 Harborline letters, a property code warning, and a document offering assisted transfer of the Hart residence. The papers were creased from being read too many times by someone who did not know which sentence was the trap. Nathan laid them on the table. The Harborline letters were clean, polite, and cold. They never threatened. They only suggested. They suggested Ranger was company property. They suggested Margaret's house required costly compliance repairs. They suggested transfer would reduce her burden. Nathan hated that word most of all, burden. It was the kind of word used by people who wanted theft to sound like help. Before they left, Nathan spent 10 minutes teaching Margaret 3 simple rules. Do not answer unknown numbers today. Do not sign anything. If someone knocks and says they are here to help, you say, "I have legal counsel now." Nothing else. Margaret tried the sentence once too softly. Nathan shook his head. "Again, Mom?" Like a door closing, she straightened as much as her back allowed. "I have legal counsel now." Ranger lifted his head. Atlas gave one short breath through his nose. Almost approval. Margaret laughed quietly, surprised by herself. It was the first sound in the room that did not belong to fear. They reached Ron's office before noon. Ron met them at the side entrance. His olive field jacket zipped halfway over a light blue button-down shirt, his dark trousers pressed but old, his brown shoes scuffed at the toes. He looked at Margaret first, then at Ranger, and his expression softened without becoming pity. "Mrs. Hart," he said, "I'm sorry about your son." Margaret nodded, but her hand stayed on Ranger's collar. Inside, Ron scanned the documents, photographed the tag compartment, and locked the chip in a small evidence pouch. He read the property letter twice. The second time, his jaw tightened. "This isn't just about a dog," he said. Nathan already knew. Ron turned one page toward them. At the bottom, beneath small print and a corporate stamp, was a reference line. Hart Residence, transfer pending, Harbor Gate 12 Review. Margaret's face went pale. Daniel's warning, Ranger's tag, and the house were tied together by the same hidden thread. Ron picked up the phone. "I'm calling legal aid." And after that, the county recorder. "Nobody signs, nobody transfers, and nobody touches that dog until we know what Daniel left behind." Ron Maddox did not let Margaret Hart leave his office with only hope. Hope, he said, was useful, but copies were better. By late afternoon, he had scanned every Harborline letter, photographed Ranger's open collar tag, placed Daniel Hart's storage chip inside a labeled evidence pouch, and sent a request to legal aid marked urgent. A housing attorney named Clara Bennett joined by video call for only 12 minutes, but 12 minutes was enough to change the air in the room. Clara was a woman in her late 40s with copper-brown hair pinned neatly at the back of her head, pale skin, square glasses, and the sharp, tired eyes of someone who had spent years reading documents written to confuse frightened people. She spoke quickly, but not unkindly. "Mrs. Hart, do not sign anything. Do not answer Harborline alone. Do not surrender the dog. If they claim ownership, they can put that claim in writing through counsel." Margaret sat very straight beside Ranger, her small hands folded over her purse. "I have legal counsel now," she said quietly at first. Clara paused, then smiled. "Exactly. Say that every time." Nathan Cole brought Margaret and Ranger back to his room before dark. Atlas walked close to Nathan's left side, but his attention never fully left the street behind them. Twice he looked back. Twice Ranger looked back a second later. Nathan noticed both times. He did not mention it to Margaret because fear did not need extra furniture in the room. Instead, he checked the stairwell, the back exit, the window latch, and the hallway camera above the landing. Margaret watched him move with controlled efficiency, not frantic, not theatrical. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, she felt protected without feeling owned. That difference mattered. Nathan set a chair near the kitchen wall and said, "If anything happens tonight, sit there. You can see the door, but you're not in front of it. Margaret tried to make a joke about being too old for drills. It came out weak. Nathan answered gently, "You're not too old to have a plan." Night settled over the harbor in layers. Outside, fog pressed against the windows and boat horns moved through the dark like distant warnings. Inside, the room smelled of coffee, old wood, wet dog fur, and the rice Nathan had reheated because none of them had eaten enough. Ranger lay near Margaret's feet. Atlas lay near the door. Nathan sat at the table writing down a timeline. Daniel's death, first harbor line visit, property letter, bus station, pickup, collar tag, Ron's office. Margaret watched the pencil move. Daniel used to make lists like that, she said. When he was afraid, Nathan asked. When he didn't want fear making decisions for him. Nathan stopped writing for a moment. That sounded like the Daniel he remembered from the faded training photo. Patient, steady, waiting beside a trembling dog, while louder men mistook stillness for weakness. At 11:17, Ranger lifted his head. He did not bark, he did not growl. He simply rose, slow and stiff, and walked to the table where Daniel's copied letters lay stacked. Then he placed one paw gently on the top page. Margaret leaned forward. The page was the Harbor Line property notice, the one that referred to the Hart residence as pending transfer. Atlas stood at the same time and faced the door. Nathan felt a cold line travel through him. It was as if Daniel had left the warning in pieces. The tag, the chip, the house, the dog. And now both canines were telling them the next piece was already outside. The first sound came 1 minute later, a soft scrape near the lock. Nathan raised one hand, palm down. Margaret moved to the chair by the kitchen wall, exactly as he had shown her. Her face had gone pale, but her phone was already in her hand. Atlas stood beside Nathan, lean body still, dark amber eyes locked on the door. Ranger stayed with Margaret, head low, shoulders squared despite the age in his joints. The scrape came again, followed by a whisper Nathan recognized from the bus station, Arlo Pike. "Just get the old dog and go," Arlo muttered outside. Vince Mercer answered, quieter and colder. "The tag first, the dog second." Nathan turned off the lamp. He did not open the door. He looped a length of paracord low between the heavy shelf and the doorstop, not to injure anyone, only to break momentum if someone forced entry. Then he pointed to Margaret's phone. She pressed record. The door pushed inward hard. The lock held for half a second, then the cheap frame cracked around the latch. Arlo came through first, shoulder lowered, face red with effort. Atlas barked once, a hard command of sound, and stopped at Nathan's knee. Arlo flinched, stepped wide, caught the low cord, and went down into the plastic laundry bin outside the room with a crash loud enough to wake the floor. Detergent bottles rolled across the hall. Vince froze behind him, black jacket wet from fog, narrow face twisting as lights flicked on behind neighboring doors. A young sailor from the room across the hall, barely 20, opened his door in a white t-shirt and sweatpants, eyes wide and hair flattened on one side. An older woman at the stairwell cracked her door and immediately lifted her phone. Margaret stood behind Nathan, small but upright, recording with both hands. Her voice shook once before it steadied. "I know your names. I know who sent you. I have legal counsel now." For the first time, Vince looked uncertain. Nathan stepped into the doorway, calm and controlled. "You walk away now," he said, "or the police get the bus station, this door, her recording, the hallway camera, and every neighbor currently watching you explain why 2 men came for an elderly woman's dog." Arlo tried to stand, slipped on a detergent cap, and cursed the floor as if the building had betrayed him personally. The young sailor muttered, "Man, that's embarrassing." Vince's jaw tightened. He wanted to repair the moment with a threat, but there was no threat strong enough to beat witnesses, cameras, 2 steady canines, and an old woman who had finally learned the sentence that closed the door. Vince grabbed Arlo by the back of his jacket and dragged him toward the stairs. "This isn't over," he said. Nathan did not move. "Put that in writing." The stairwell door slammed below them. Only then did Ranger release a low breath and sit down beside Margaret. Atlas lowered his head and sniffed near the laundry bin. His nose nudged a folded paper half hidden under Arlo's dropped glove. Nathan picked it up with a towel and opened it on the table. The page bore Harbor Line's internal stamp. 4 lines stood out in black print. Retrieve K9, secure collar tag, avoid police contact, Hart residence transfer pending. Margaret lowered herself into the chair. Her hand went to the faded silver wedding ring on her left hand. "They were going to take my son's house and my son's dog," she whispered. Nathan looked at Ranger, then at the broken door frame. "Not tonight." By morning, Ron Maddox would have the video, the paper, the names, and the proof that Harborline's polite letters had teeth behind them. By sunrise, the broken doorframe had been photographed, the hallway footage had been copied, and Ron Maddox had received the paper Arlo Pike dropped outside Nathan Cole's room. Ron did not sound surprised when Nathan called. Men like Ron rarely wasted energy on surprise when evidence had finally decided to speak. "Bring Mrs. Hart home," he said. "Clara is filing the emergency notice this morning. The county recorder has been alerted." Harborline can write all the polite letters they want, but for now, nobody transfers that house. Margaret Hart sat at Nathan's table with both hands wrapped around a mug she had not drunk from. Ranger lay against her feet, exhausted but watchful, while Atlas stood near the repaired temporary latch Nathan had screwed into the door before dawn. Margaret looked smaller in the morning light, her white-gray hair loose from its bun, her pale blue eyes red from a night without sleep. But when Nathan told her she could go back to the Hart house, she did not look relieved. She looked afraid. "I don't know if I can walk in without him," she whispered. Nathan knew she did not mean Ranger. She meant Daniel. The Hart house sat on a narrow road above the old harbor, where salt wind bent the grass and gulls circled over rusted storage roofs. It was a small white house with peeling paint, a sagging porch rail, rain stains under the eaves, and a front step split down the middle. To a property company, it would have looked tired, underused, and easy to price. To Margaret, it was 40 years of meals, arguments, birthdays, medicine bottles, Sunday hymns on a kitchen radio, and Daniel coming home after night shifts with Ranger trotting beside him. Nathan parked across the road and waited. He did not tell her to be brave. People said that when they wanted grief to move faster. Atlas sat straight at Nathan's left side, ears forward. Ranger stood beside Margaret, old legs trembling, nose lifted toward the house as if he had been carrying the way back inside him all along. Margaret finally stepped out, one hand on Ranger's collar, the other on her faded silver wedding ring. Before Margaret reached the porch, Ranger pulled gently toward the broken front step. Not hard, not disobedient, just certain. He lowered his nose to the split in the wood and gave one soft whine. Margaret froze. Nathan crouched and looked beneath the step. Wedged behind a loose board was a small brass house key, green at the edges from weather. Margaret covered her mouth. "Daniel kept a spare there when he was a boy," she said. "I forgot." Nathan lifted the key and placed it in her palm. For a moment, Margaret did not see an old step or a damaged house. She saw a 10-year-old Daniel hiding a key where his father told him not to, grinning because he thought every secret was an adventure. The old dog had remembered what grief had buried, and suddenly the house did not feel empty. It felt as if someone had been waiting for her to come back. Margaret unlocked the door with that old brass key. The house smelled of closed windows, dust, cedar, and time. A thin line of light cut across the living room floor. A chair sat crooked near the window. A framed photograph of Daniel in work clothes lay face down on the side table, not broken, only turned away. Margaret crossed the room slowly and set it upright. Daniel Hart looked back from the frame. Square, kind face, short brown hair, warm eyes, one hand resting on Ranger's younger head. Margaret touched the glass. She cried then, quietly, with no apology. Ranger pressed against her skirt. Atlas remained near the door, alert but calm, as if honoring a house that belonged to another dog first. Nathan stood outside the moment until Margaret turned and nodded for him to come in. Nathan began with the porch step because it was the first thing that could hurt someone coming home. He changed out the split board, tightened the rail, and checked the lock before touching anything else. When Margaret asked why he started there, he said, "People should be able to come home without tripping." She laughed through tears, and the sound made the room less abandoned. Over the next days, Ron and Clara Bennett kept pressure on the county office. Harborline's attempted transfer was paused. The complaint packet now included the hallway video, the internal retrieval order, Daniel's chip, the collar tag photos, and Margaret's recorded statement. Vince Mercer and Arlo Pike were no longer shadows in parking lots. They were names attached to evidence. Work changed the house inch by inch. Nathan replaced the porch light. Margaret washed curtains yellowed by dust. Atlas patrolled the fence line while Ranger chose the shade beneath the porch as if reclaiming a post. Ron visited with boxes of copied documents and a slow, satisfied nod when Clara's first formal letter forced Harborline to respond through counsel instead of intimidation. No one called it victory yet. Real justice moved slower than fear. But the house stayed in Margaret's name. Ranger stayed at her side. And for the first time in months, no strange truck waited across the road. Nathan planned to leave once the house was safe. He said it after dinner on the fifth evening, while Margaret folded towels in the kitchen and the two dogs slept near the screen door. "You'll be all right now," he said. Margaret did not argue. She simply looked toward the stairs. "There's a room upstairs, small, but it faces the water." Nathan shook his head. "Mom, I didn't do this for a room." "I know," she said. "That is why I can offer it." Ranger lifted his head. Atlas did too. Both dogs looked at Nathan with the still patience of creatures who had already voted. Margaret smiled faintly. "Old houses need stubborn men. Old dogs need someone who understands their silence." Nathan stayed. Not as a rescuer collecting gratitude, not as a soldier waiting for orders. He stayed because the house had work, the dogs had purpose, and Margaret had learned to read every paper before fear could sign it for her. Weeks later, a new wooden sign hung beneath the repaired porch light. Harbor Light K9 House. Quiet rest for old soldiers and loyal dogs. Some rooms were rented on quiet weekends to pay for repairs. One room was kept open for veterans and retired working dogs who needed rest more than scenery. At sunset, Margaret sat on the porch with one hand on Ranger's head. Nathan stood near the rail, Atlas steady at his side, both facing the harbor. Margaret had not gotten Daniel back. Nathan had not recovered what war had taken. But the house no longer felt like a place grief had locked. It felt like a door left open, guarded by two loyal dogs, waiting for tired hearts to find their way home. Sometimes the miracle does not arrive with thunder, bright lights, or a voice from the sky. Sometimes God sends it quietly. It may come through an old dog who still remembers the way home. It may come through a tired soldier who thinks he has nothing left to give. It may come through an elderly woman who keeps holding on, even when the world tells her to let go. In everyday life, many people are carrying silent battles. Some are fighting to keep a home. Some are grieving someone they never stopped loving. Some are trying to smile while carrying fear, bills, loneliness, or memories no one else can see. This story reminds us that no act of kindness is too small when God places it in the right moment. A spare key, a repaired step, a loyal dog, a stranger who stops walking and chooses to care. Sometimes those are the miracles heaven uses to bring people back home. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and share the name of a person or a loyal dog you still remember. And if you believe stories like this still matter, please like this video, subscribe to Navy SEAL and K9 Stories, and stay with us for more stories about courage, loyalty, faith, and the quiet miracles that happen when good people refuse to look away. May God bless you, your family, and every tired heart watching this today. May He protect those who feel alone, comfort those who are grieving, and guide each of us to become the answer to someone else's prayer.